Hi everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Tico and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Jyoti Thottam's new book, Sisters of Mokama, the pioneering women who brought hope and healing to India, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin on 4th Avenue's Brook Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Brook Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 94 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass-Whiten. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we're thrilled to have Jyoti Thottam with us for a discussion of her new book, Sisters of Mokama. Jyoti is a senior opinion editor at the New York Times. Prior to joining the Times, she was a reporter, editor, and foreign correspondent. From 2008 to 2012, she was Times South Asia Bureau Chief in New Delhi, where she wrote numerous cover stories, including award-winning stories about the Ganges River and the Mumbai terrorist attacks. Born in India, she grew up in Texas and graduated from Yale and Columbia. She lives with her family in Brooklyn. Joining Jyoti in conversation is Arun Venugopal. Arun is a senior reporter in the Race and Justice Unit at WNYC in New York. He also serves as a guest host at Fresh Air, regularly sitting in for Terry Gross, and often contributes to NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered. He has appeared on PBS NewsHour and CBS, and has been published in The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and The Atlantic. He lives with his family in Jackson Heights. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Arun and Jyoti to the stage.
Oh, nice book. So is it fiction or nonfiction? All right. Well, hi, everyone. This is really cool. I feel like this is the first, I think this is like the first live event I'm doing in New York in 2 years.
Wow.
Anyways, so hey, New York, right? And big hand for Jyoti, everyone. For putting out this amazing book and this real incredible sort of contribution to our, I think, to our public understanding about, I mean, for me, I can tell you, we have several things in common, Jyoti and I guess we've known each other for a while, I guess partly because we were both involved in something called the South Asian Journalists Association, or SAJA, which is played a...
We have the same hometown, too, although we didn't know each
Yeah,
other.
we do. So the SAJA with Jyoti was actually the president of just like this megalomaniac, right? You were like this completely like insane, power-hungry. And then there's Houston, which we're both, is our hometown. But also, I don't think you knew this, but like your mom, who became a nurse, my mom also, who grew up in rural Kerala, became a nurse. And so we have all these, points of connection. And for me, that's one of the reasons why reading this book was such an important, and just meaningful process, because it kind of, these things on paper and yeah, mom was a nurse, it was really great. I was proud of that. My dad was a doctor and all that, but not really understanding until I read your book that these enormous forces that came together at a particular moment in history, and which were not only about, India, but were really part of these global forces. Mm-hmm. And, this particular moment when you had independence, decolonization, but also just the confluence of people from different cultures and societies, and not just a small group of these white American women who came from, from the US and made their way to India, but also people from across India who came to this very particular place at a very particular moment. So we're gonna discuss all of this, and we're gonna chat for a while, and then we'll open it up to questions, because I know some of you definitely do have some questions about this process which you've been through, but also trying to make sense of this incredible moment in the 40s and in the 50s when so much happened, and I think which many of us either take for granted or just never knew about. So I guess one thing that I think we can start out with this book is, a lot of writers, they say, I spent years on this process, like 5 or 6 or 7 years. But for you, this is really sort of a quarter century in the making, isn't it?
Yeah, in a way it is. Thank you, Arun, and thanks everyone for coming. Also, it makes me feel a little bit old to think of it that way, but that's okay. It's true that
you're 3 years old.
But it's true that this story, I thought of it in some ways as sort of like the craziest story that I heard in my family, right? Like, I'm sure every family has one of those, like the craziest story. But it was just this thing that like I couldn't quite let go of. Like, I was just like, okay, I know this has something to do with me and my family and like how we got here, but what was this place? Like these nuns from Kentucky, and and it was so far away from Kerala where we grew up. I mean, like far away, in both figuratively and geographically, like just so different. So when I was in my 20s, I was freelancing, traveling around India, and definitely like didn't know any better. I just decided, you know what? I'm just going to go there. I'm going to just find this place and visit this place and see what it's actually like. This place that my mother had talked about for so long. And
I mean, that was crazy. This is a schlep. I mean, this is serious. This is not like just.
And this was in the late 90s also, like before phones, before the internet really like came to India. I mean, I literally had to send the nuns a telegram to tell them like when my train was going to arrive.
And then your train was late, but they anyways got the telegram late, so it all worked out in the end.
Yeah,
is that right?
It all worked out. But it really is one of those places where, if something happened to you, like no one would know for days. It's that remote and like so. I mean, remote in the sense of like it's not a place that people just sort of turn up in, like Delhi or Bombay or New York or. I mean, even people in India, when you talk about Mokama or you talk about Bihar, if you say, oh, well, I'm just going to Bihar, they're just like, well, why would you ever go there unless like you need a really, really good reason to go there. But I felt like I had one.
And I think there's a wonderful detail when you first journeyed there, when you realized there's a very abrupt change when you suddenly cross the state border into from maybe UP, Uttar Pradesh, into Bihar. What was that again? Was it like that all these unticketed passengers just leaping into the
Yeah. So that was, again, like when I went on that trip, I didn't tell my parents that I was doing this, but I just, I got my ticket, I went there and
why did you not tell them?
Well, I think my parents are maybe on the Zoom call, but it was just
You're like, maybe it's time you can finally reveal this thing 25 years later.
But my curiosity was just an irresistible force at the time. What can I say? So I went there, but even my relatives in Delhi were like, well, you should be careful, Bihar. You hear all these stories about it, and sure enough, like it really did happen this way where, you're on the train and it's a long overnight train journey. And there was a point when you just sort of noticed like, oh, sudden, like, you board in Delhi and it's a, big bustling train station. Everyone has tickets. And then, people are getting on and off at different stations, but you knew when you got to Bihar because suddenly there were just all these people. It's like everything, you could just feel everything sort of change. It was that kind of place.
I had a cousin who's in the railways. He said, yeah, I knew that we had suddenly gotten to this totally different place when people started getting on with their sheep and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I want to go to this place. Where's this place where people board on the trains with sheep? But I know there is, and I don't know how much of that has changed, but what was, when you got off for the first time at Mokama, do you remember, I mean, what did it feel like and what did it look like?
Well, so two things. I mean, the nuns, two of the nuns, I think there was someone to meet me. They were incredibly warm, like very excited to get visitors, as they always are. And one thing that I think is hard for many people to understand, like I have spent a lot of time with nuns over the last few years, every time I visit a convent or have, like, there's always a point at which they're like, so like, when are you going to join the convent? Because for them, like, they assume that,
Sure, you're a journalist, whatever.
but it not simply like an effort to get people to join, but they really, at least these nuns, the ones that I spent time with, you can tell from the book, like they're so active in the world, so passionate about what they do. They just feel like the work that they're doing is like the most interesting thing that anyone could possibly be doing. So of course, like, why wouldn't I want to be part of their community? And no,
I mean, and this is like, it's super intense work, but despite
really
all that.
It's really intense, but the thing about doing that kind of work and living in a community, I mean, there are women who, they don't have like husbands and children, like they really just focus on their work, but their days are so structured. They also, this is another thing that I discovered about them, is that they take their like hour or two of recreation in the evenings very, very seriously. So like when it's time, like dinner's finished, they've got like an hour before like evening prayers and time for bed. They're having fun, like they're playing cards, they're watching their serials, they're watching television, they're watching movies, like they just want to chat, and it's like, this is the life, like this is really fun,
And I suppose when you have that, like, very different from our own situation nowadays, where you can just be like, you can be at church and somebody's probably looking at their phone and looking at Facebook or Twitter or Instagram right then and there, like that. There is a very clear demarcation between like this very rigorous life and the very urgent need to also just decompress and unwind for an hour or two every day.
And they're basically like with their best friends like all the time. They're in this community. So they're not sort of like by themselves. It was really sort of, and I think that helped me understand like what kept them going, like why were they doing this? I mean, they were so, they take their work very, very seriously, so it's like, if, like as I described in the book, like when they decide to train people as nurses, they're very serious about the training they're giving people. It's not just kind of, oh, here, like take this first aid kit and become a nurse. Like, no, they wanted to do like serious training. When they decided they could have a surgeon, I mean, the convent paid for this one of their members to go to Georgetown Medical School and then train as a surgeon for like 10 years, just so that she could then serve at the hospital. And she was at the time one of only like 100 nuns who were also doctors in the entire world. And
I mean, she was like really a legendary, I mean, she ranks right up, I mean, this is a true trailblazer. We're talking Dr. Wiss, right?
Dr. Wiss,
Let's go back though. I mean, I feel like you're encountering this place for the first time because it's part of your story and your family story and your mom's story. But you're placing that into a much larger sort of a canvas, right? And what was it about, this origin point of this particular institution in this kind of back of beyond place that made you realize that there was something much bigger than just your family story? What was it about this moment in the 1940s when just, everything is both falling apart and being created anew? It's like empires are falling and new nations are being birthed, and there is, massive violence, massive starvation happening, and yet somehow there's something very special kind of comes, it's just kind of like springs from the ground. What was it that made you realize that this was not just the story of your mom and a few people who, created a little hospital in the village?
Yeah, it's such a great question, because this book, in a way, it is a personal story. I mean, it starts from, trying to place my own family story in the kind of larger story of the United States, of India, like, how and why people sort of moved between these two places. But, I knew in a sense that like my story didn't start in 1971 when I was born, or 1974 when my parents came to the United States. Like if I really wanted to understand, again, as you said, like we're not just simply individuals like making choices about where we're going and where our families are going. We are also products of all these historical forces around us, and our choices shape the history around us. So I guess like when I started sort of peeling back, why did my parents come to the United States? I had to look back and say like, well, why did my mother go to that nursing school? And then I had to peel back that even further, like, well, why did that nursing school even exist in that place? And so that's really like how I sort of, I thought the book initially would start at 1947, but really I had to go back even a little bit further to the end of the war, because to understand, why were these women so motivated to go to India when so many people were fleeing this place? I mean, fleeing Bihar in particular, but like, they were sort of going toward the chaos and toward the violence rather than away from it. I mean, their own country, America, was at peace. Like, why? You'd think that you wouldn't feel at that moment the urge to go abroad, but they did. And so trying to understand that, like that's sort of where I started the book.
So one of the, I guess, very important parts of your project is finally, I guess, recognizing that you have this incredible trove of materials at your disposal, right? Like, at what point did you encounter this wealth of letters and archival materials? Like, and to what extent did that happen before you decided this is a book, or was it something you said, I want to do a book, and like, oh, by the way, there's this amazing resource I have?
So a little bit of both, and I have to say some of this was the sort of blissful ignorance of the first-time author, like not really understanding like what you really should have before you start writing a book. But when I started down this road of like thinking, okay, I think I can really turn this story into a book, and like let me do the research. So the convent, the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth, who almost from the beginning, like they were very open about arranging interviews and talking to me, but they were reluctant to but I wanted more. I said, okay, it was great, I talked to these people, like they're very friendly, but I really want to, like, I want the documents, like I want the primary sources, like, do you have anything? And so they would give me these like every few weeks, and there may also be one or two of the archivists from the order on the line, so thank you very much. Thank you, Kathy, if you're there. So they would send me a few letters that were like related to specific events, like that the order had in their archives. And then they would send me a few more a few weeks later, and each one was just like better than the next, like these incredibly vivid descriptions of the journey from Kentucky to India, like what they first saw. And, but again, it was just sort of specific moments in time, and I knew that there was more. So it took me like several months of, gently kind of prodding them to.
I want it all.
And it was so interesting because they, as much as they were open, they were very reluctant to actually do that, because until I started this book, they had never opened their archives to anyone outside of the order, except in a few cases. Like there were some Civil War historians, like a much earlier period, and then people researching their own genealogy and might have had a relative who was in the convent, but they had never really opened up their archives in this way. So I actually had to just go to Kentucky and talk to the president of the order to convince her. And I will never forget that conversation. I mean, she was just, Susan Gatz, she was just so kind and so forward thinking. Like she said to me that she realized that this archive of material was significant, like not just for the order, but for the whole, but really for women's history, because their contributions to, you know, both the project of the order of the Catholic Church and to the history of India. Like, if they didn't make that available, like really it would have been lost to history otherwise. So I'm really like so grateful that they were able to do that, that they decided to do that. So that was only the first step.
Okay. And are you encountering this when you go physically to the archives? Are you seeing a digitized or actual physical letters that they have in their collection?
So again, that was a long process. So most of what they had was not actually digitized when I started. So the archivists, again, like as I was, like they were digitizing it as I was asking to see it. So it's like most of it had not been digitized before. There was some material that was only available to me like when I visited. So I went and spent some time like looking at there's some material that I had to see that way. So again, it was just like, and I'm so grateful to all the work that they did to do that, because it's just such painstaking work to like turn all of these written materials into PDFs, which they did. But that was really only the beginning, because again, like I had the record of the order, but again, like the more I learned about the story and what was going on and the individuals, like I started to sort of understand the 6 original women and Dr. Wiss and the other people. I started to understand them as individuals, like they all had sort of different reasons for being there. They had different personalities, like different skills. I just I wanted to know them as people, and I just wanted to see a record again, like, you know, if you're a journalist or a historian, you can't rely on just only one source, right? So, so then I started a whole second project of like tracking down the families of each of the original nuns, and I was able to find, I was able to actually talk to all but I think one of them, but 2 of the sisters, they had written letters home to their families like every week or every month for years and years. And so when I found these families, I went and visited them, and both of I really can't tell you like how generous they were. And I mean, I had that feeling when I met them that like they had been keeping these letters so carefully for so many years, and almost like hoping that one day someone would show up at their door and like want to know the story, because like in a sense, like the same way that I felt like I knew my part of the story, like this was just a crazy, remarkable story, but that like no one has told. It's like these families also knew that we had this aunt, and again, because they were nuns, they had no children to carry this on. Like we had this aunt or this great aunt or whoever it was who did all these amazing things, and we have all her letters here, but they just like, they didn't know what to do with it. You know, like they were just hoping that it would stay in the family somehow. But basically until I got there. And so then once I got there, they were very happy for me to take them. And then I spent the hours like, you know.
Were any people in this process, either the order or any of these relatives, wary of your intentions or how you might frame it in a way that wasn't necessarily gonna, you know, I mean, because we're talking about a lot of documents, a lot of, you know, letters. People say things when they're struggling through, you know, life in some village, hardships. I'm just wondering if that was ever a concern that you picked up on.
Not so much from the sisters, I think, because by the time I was writing, like they had all passed away by the time that I had that I was looking at their letters. I would say it was more from actually the women of my mother's generation, who like they went through a lot. Like I spoke to many of them, and I think that they were sort of concerned that I appreciate the nuance that like, yes, it was a really difficult life for them. I mean, they were young women, far from home, you know, in this place, in an institution run by white American women who didn't really understand them as like young people. And it was hard. And there were things that they really didn't like about it. Like they were, you know, the nuns were very strict. Like there definitely was conflict. But so I think the only thing people were hesitant about was like, would I portray it fairly? You know, that yes, it was a harsh place. It could be very difficult for them, but it also like gave them essentially the means to live the lives that they couldn't have done otherwise.
Yeah. When we talk about that era and you're like going through all the different sort of existing works and texts that are sort of helping you understand, you know, this particular moment, like sort of like this nascent moment in modern Indian history, were there certain ones that really helped you especially understand, you know, that, you know, the politics and sort of the geopolitics of this, and then helped you understand what you could conceivably add to it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's funny. I think if I had started to write this book, say, you know, 20 or 25 years ago, like if I tried to write this book soon after my first visit to Mokama, I think that the historical part of it would have been for me much more difficult, because I really had the advantage, you know, writing in these last few years of a sort of newer generation of scholars in history and political science and other fields, many of them in India, some in the UK and some here, who have started to look at the history of India during World War II and around partition in a way that was like completely new to me. I mean, compared to like when I was in college. So
How so?
In the sense that like you get this sense of like India as fully part of World War II. I mean, there have been several books now on this subject. Srinath Raghavan's book, Yasmin Khan's book,
Raghu
Karnad's book, which is, again, he's a journalist. Like his book is a really interesting book. That it was for me to get a sense of like that feeling of being a soldier or just an ordinary person during World War II in that time. Also, Madhushree Mukherjee's book about the famine in India during World War II, or I think there were two of them actually, but that was incredibly important for me to understand some of the context of like what India had gone through even before partition. I mean, you know, most of us probably have seen the movie Gandhi. Like we sort of have those images of like the terrible violence of partition, but like to really understand what had come before that, I thought was really important to me. Particularly, you know, there were a few references in the letters and interviews to you know, to food rationing and shortages and malnutrition, and you know, one of the women in the book, Celine Minge, I mean, she herself, like she is from a tribal area that really had suffered during World War II, and she was a baby, a child during that time. So to understand like what was that, like what was going on, again, the historical forces around why was this particular girl starving, and you know, what did it take for her and her mother to get beyond that and finally to like reach a nursing school and be, you know, and sort of get an education for herself. Like to me, that was really important to put it in that context.
Yeah, and the extraordinary resilience of these people who are willing to just kind of like defy all the odds and expectations, and arrive at a place where they can sort of like make the most of their innate abilities and stuff like that. There's this one passage which I feel like, you know, in terms of like, as you said there, just the idea that I mean, as someone who has lived in India and who's, you know, went there many times over the course of my youth and childhood and all that stuff like that, you can that sense of deprivation can seem very distant and abstract, the kind of stuff that you write about and the conditions here, and the extent to which not just for people arriving from Kentucky or rural Massachusetts or whatever, but for people coming from other parts of India. It's like a graphic and completely almost inexplicable level of deprivation and precarity, really. I mean, you mentioned like the patients suffered from misfortunes they had never seen or heard before in Kerala. They had leprosy and tuberculosis, and you mentioned all these kind of knife wounds that all these people have. You know, there's violence and there are these health issues that if you are coming from a place like Kerala, which has relatively higher living standards, it is really kind of shocking for these people, isn't it?
Yeah, that was the other thing, you know, that presence of violence that was always kind of in the background. Again, you know, I wanted to understand this place, like not simply in the sort of stereotypical way of like, oh, Bihar is this horrible, violent place and everyone is just killing each other, but trying to understand like, where did that come from? And, you know, again, as I started to unravel the threads of this, it's like, well, why were there, you know, bomb blasts and guns? And, you know, India is not a place, sadly, like the United States, where there are, you know, guns easily available, legally available on every corner. Like, so to try to understand, like, well, why were they so prevalent in Bihar and in a place like Mokama? And I mean, honestly, it does go back to partition and the, you know, the particular kind of political chaos after partition, where there were some, I mean, essentially armed militias formed, and those same armed militias like sort of morphed and changed and became sort of caste-based militias. And honestly, the only thing that's changed is that they serve different political masters now, but that was very present in 1946, 1947, in the 50s and 60s, when the, you know, the sisters were operating their hospital, and in a different form today as well.
And all the more amazing that they rushed into this. I know when they're drawn there, is it Reverend Batson? Who kind of,
the Jesuit?
Yeah, who kind of like initially sort of sets the sort of series of events that kind of eventually lead to them. I mean, how open was he, and how much did they go in with their eyes open to not just health issues, but real violence?
Well, as far as I can tell from the record, like, I don't think they really had any idea about that. And I mean, partly, you know, I think they were only in touch with a handful of the Jesuits who were already operating in that area. So, you know, I doubt that they would have been telling them like, oh, how horrible and violent it is, because they really wanted these women to come and help and run the hospital and take over. But the other thing to remember is that, you know, this is the violence that was happening, especially when it was happening in villages, like the news of it wouldn't necessarily reach even the cities in Bihar for days, you know. So it was that kind of situation where there was a lot going on that even people in India wouldn't have been aware of.
I just want to be sensitive to time. What is it, about 7:40, something like that? Yeah. Okay, all right. So you know, one of the challenges, I suppose, when you're covering this kind of terrain as a writer is, I suppose, confronting the possibilities, or inadvertently perhaps perpetuating a white savior narrative, right? Like, you've got these people coming from the West, they're there to, you know, do good, and that can take all kinds of, you know, forms. Is that something that you saw in the archives, in the letters, that you saw evidence of, in terms of the way that they, even as they're doing good, in terms of their attitudes, that kind of, to you, especially with, you know, 70 or 80 years of kind of distance, that you kind of encountered?
Well, I think reading the records of the order, there was definitely some of that. I mean, they were there. I mean, again, they took their work as nurses and doctors extremely seriously. So most of what they're writing about is just the difficulties in, in getting medicines, the cases they would see. I mean, that's most of what seemed to occupy their time, just the logistics of like, how do we get permits for the cement to build the new isolation wing, like that kind of thing. Like they're very absorbed with that. But there definitely is that sense of like, oh, we're here to do good. So I think that was why I spent like probably just as much effort trying to find as many accounts as I could from the nurses who studied with them. I mean, I visited the place many times. And so the second half of the book, for me, I thought of it as, okay, these women from Kentucky came to India, they accomplished something like quite remarkable just within 2 years of arriving. But then once they open up their community to these Indian women, everything gets more complicated. And to me, also, like that's when the story gets much more interesting, because these women who may have come thinking like, oh, we'll sort of do what, Indians can't do for themselves, at least at that time, they're confronted by these young Indian women who have very strong ideas of their own. They themselves have left their homes because like they're out of here, like they want, they're sort of doing their own thing now, like and they were remarkably like not shy about challenging these American women. But what was even more remarkable is that the institution and the women who were running it were open to change. And I think that's the only reason why this hospital, this institution has survived all these years, is that they were willing to change. And I mean, it's run today, it's completely run by Indian women. The hospital is, and a lot of the leadership of the order now includes Indian women from Belize, and like all the other places where they're operating.
Okay, so they were adaptive.
They really were, yeah.
That's so interesting. We can, there's a mic that we have one or two of, so anybody have any questions they'd like to ask now?
So when I started,
you can use the mic, please. Yeah, because
So when I started,
you're virtually.
I beg your pardon?
People who are also watching this virtually.
Yes, right.
So yeah.
When I started reading the excerpt, it was fascinating, and I very much look forward to reading the rest of the book. But it was also some of the strokes seemed very familiar to me, and I eventually realized that it was because I have like an unwholesome fascination with Mother Teresa.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to me that in some ways Mother Teresa is kind of like the caricature or the parade float for what you were looking into. I mean, somebody who's doing something kind of similar, the steps of whose progress were not totally unlike the steps of the progress that you were describing. And yet, somebody who totally blew up in terms of, she'd be unlike your sisters who you had to pry information out about. Mother Teresa was somebody you couldn't escape the information about her. And I wondered whether the sisters, whether the nuns that you talked to, or your mother, or you yourself, ever felt sort of that presence.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I get this question a lot, and Mother Teresa as a figure, in a sense, she was like also a little bit in the background, like throughout this time, because she came to India at about the same time. I think she had been in India a few years before these sisters arrived, but then she started her mission in Calcutta, like almost at about the same time that they started their mission. And there are a few points, I mean, Calcutta is like, quite far from this place. Like it was one of the two big cities that they would go to. So in their letters and in the mission annals, like there are occasional references to either meeting her or encountering that order in Calcutta. So she was kind of like there in the background, but it was also very clear. I mean, there's a passage in the book about like one very clear reference to like when they all when this order and Mother Teresa, like I think this was in the late 1950s, like they attend this sort of like seminar together, a seminar for religious orders, and it's all about like basically the Catholic Church itself. Like there were some people at that time who were trying to kind of modernize the way that religious orders were operating, and so it was this whole seminar about like trying to introduce like psychological principles of counseling to within the order, and also like their own work. And this is like, again, I don't want to cast aspersions, but I do think it's interesting that like Florence Joseph from this order who went, like she immediately was like, oh yes, like this is really like, we have to start doing this like right away. And then Mother Teresa, I mean, again, like like this is all in their records, like that she decided like, no, I don't need to do this. Like, well, sort of. So there were, I guess my point is like, there were many different ways of being a nun and doing this kind of work in India at that time.
Yeah, I found that really interesting because it suddenly shows you how relatively progressive this order is in terms of like, yeah, why not? Why would mental health not be part of our thing?
Yeah.
Embrace it. Whereas you have more conservative approaches elsewhere.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Our next question is actually from a virtual attendee who says, were the nuns you interviewed aware that so many of their nursing students moved to the US and maintained a Mokama community here? My mother is a proud Mokama alumnus.
That's so cool. We have a Mokama alumnus watching. So
yeah, that's great. Yeah, they were. In fact, I mean, not all of the say Mokama graduates have done this, but like some have definitely kept in touch with the order, and they've visited. They've done they do some fundraising in a sort of informal way for the order. They visit, but I think probably, I mean, the order is definitely very aware that like so many of the nurses are in the United States now. I think in different cities, like I think in New York, definitely in the Toronto area, in Houston, where my mother is, like there are sort of little networks of Mokama graduates. I mean, it was such a formative experience for them. They were so young that, naturally many of them have stayed very good friends.
does it still have like a brand, like, oh, the Mokama, it's here they come, like is it like more tough and rigorous, or just like we've seen it all?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's some of that.
Oh, wow. Any more questions yet?
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Jyoti, and I look forward to reading the book. I just, when you were talking, it just occurred to me that there was, I was reminded of people like Kumari Jayavarna writing about women who went from Scotland and Ireland in particular to Sri Lanka as teachers, and in her narration of it, it's as much a story about an evolving feminism in Ireland and Scotland as it is about what the women did in Sri Lanka. It was for them a way to escape family pressures, a way to escape all the regular expectations, and have an adventure in a way that all these travel stories are of all these male explorers, and this is sort of an alternative. So I was wondering how much of that was here as well. Were they leaving something as much as they were?
Yeah, I think they were. I mean, this is something that it definitely shaped, I think, the initial decision of the order to leave Kentucky and do this mission. I mean, that and it's an interesting tension. Like, these were religious women, but they're also women, and so they found themselves bound by the norms of femininity, the norms around gender, in the same way that like every other woman in the 1940s and 50s were. So they very much felt that same impulse, like during World War II in the United States, when there were so many women who worked in factories, who worked in offices, who had never been able to do that before. And then when they were forced, I mean, many of them like had that opportunity taken away from them, and they were like, oh no, now the war is over, the men are back, like you have to. Some of them kind of went along with that and were sort of bitter ever afterward. Some of them said, no, forget it. Like now we've seen this, like we're not going back. And so that impulse was very much present in the order at the time, like the communication of the superiors of the order to the younger nuns in the order, like during World War II, was all about like, no, we know there's a lot going on in the world, but you have to, like, we really have to, our role is to follow the rules. And they really like did not, they were pushing and pushing and pushing at every opportunity. So when they had that chance to go abroad, like they really jumped at it. It was very much part of what they were going through.
And I think that larger arc is just so fascinating because, we kind of can very well assume that, onward and upward, human evolution and freedom and rights, right? They keep on expanding, but then we see like the Cold War sort of very, the heteronormative, like nuclear family led by the dad and, mother in her nice dress in the suburbs, and they all come home. But before that, you've got the Rosie Riveter and the wars, like all hands on deck. And then you take it back even further when you talk about the formation of this order, and you said, in the early days, there was this frontier spirit, and everybody just basically, worked really hard, and there was something very liberating. And then it kind of regressed in certain ways because
Kentucky, Kentucky prospered, and then women were not required. I mean, it was part of the settler project, of course, I have to acknowledge that, but they were not required to be out in the field. Like, then it's like once these families were more prosperous, like, oh, now you should stay at home and be, I think the phrase was like, to be like decorative and useless, like that's, and that was something that many women in Kentucky pushed against.
But it was really kind of, you felt like sort of encoded in the DNA of this order?
Yeah, I think so. But again, there was that back and forth over the years.
Yeah. Any more questions right here?
Thank you, Jyoti. This is really inspirational. I read the article in the New York Times, and I want to say it was inspirational because, and my question is going to be personal, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I think many of us, I was born in Mumbai. We grew up with stories in 1947, the time of decolonization, and have these great stories from our family. And I'm curious what your family thought, because to have this in writing, like, it is beautiful, because we don't get to hear enough of these sort of stories. And secondly, what was if you had to capture an emotion while you were writing this, I gather you said 15 years you'd been sort of coming into this. What would it be? Like, what was that emotion for you, or the one that really, where was something much more profound for you when you were writing this?
Those are both really great questions. So I have to say, like, both my parents are still around. I'm very lucky, and so I don't want to speak for them, like how they feel about all of this. I mean, I think obviously, like, they're very happy and proud, and they've been super supportive, like, through all of this. I do think I've heard from them a little bit of like, it is kind of an odd thing to have, someone in your family write about your family in a very public way. So, I mean, you'll see from the book that there are threads of my family story, but it's not like sort of all the deep, dark secrets. Like, you'll have to wait for my daughter's book to read that one, I'm sure. But I was very conscious, I mean, both for them, for my own kids, like, and just for the story. I think the thing that kept me going is, when I would think about what all these women had gone through, what my own mother had gone through, just like the care that they took with everything. I think as I was writing the book, my main goal was like, I just wanted the book itself to really do justice to what they had done. So.
Any other questions? I'm guessing we're pretty much almost at time, but.
Well, we have time for one more question, and we do actually have a virtual one.
Great.
And it says, I was born in Nazareth Hospital. I'd like to know I would like to know more about the time Jyoti's mother was there and her experiences, if you have anything more you can share.
Great question.
Sure. Yeah, and it's wonderful to hear from someone who was born at Nazareth, because I do occasionally get these messages from people, or I see comments about, I mean, Nazareth Hospital has been around for such a long time that it's quite an institution in that place now. There are, so many people in the town who were, I mean, for so many years, it was the only hospital in Mokama. So if you were born in a hospital, like that was probably the place where you were born. And they also ran a school where in another city that where many of the graduates, they recognized the story. I mean, there's a lot more in the book about my mother's experience of the hospital. I mean, that was a time when, again, I think the hospital itself was really growing and changing. And it's like, I would say by the time she left, it was still probably the only real hospital in the town, but Mokama itself has changed. I mean, there are several like sort of big modern hospitals in the town now. So they have really, again, like they've adapted and changed over time. So, in the 80s, they started HIV and AIDS care at a time when, no one else was doing that. Now they've shifted to, they do hospice work, again, the kind of work that like very few other places are willing to do. And so it had sort of reduced to a clinic, like mostly an outpatient clinic. But then during COVID, again, I had, I was concerned about people there, how they were getting along. I mean, when India was having the worst of its COVID outbreak, there was a real push that like they just needed beds. So there was one, again, a nun, Sister Shanti, like the only doctor who was still there, because it's been continually very difficult for them to get doctors who are willing to live in a place like this, who is basically working like around the clock for like 2 months, just trying to do the best they could for the people of Mokama.
But with your mom, just to stay on this question, like, was there, like, it's a process of interviewing anybody, but especially people you're kind of like navigating, you're like, she's your mom. Was there, was there some point where you have to, you're drawing her out to really understand this thing in a way that she's like, wow, it's just, it's a thing I did for a few years.
Yeah, I think that happened, I mean, definitely with my mom, but also for many of the nurses that I interviewed, there were certain episodes, certain stories, things that happened that they could describe for me in great detail, like a particular thing that happened or a particular story. But again, try to imagine like the way that you view your world when you're like 15, 16, 17, it's like you have this sort of specific view of just what's happening to you and your friends. And like, so, that's something I had to keep reminding myself, like as I was interviewing both my mom, who I think of her as my mom, but she was like a very young woman at that time that she was going through this. So she was experiencing these nuns as like her teachers, these people who were kind of like far removed. Like, so that was one of the most interesting things, is that all these, my mom and her classmates and other nurses who studied at that time, like they definitely had their impressions of these women, but they really didn't know very much about them, like their lives before they came to India, like where their families were from. So that was up to me to discover separately and kind of fill in on my own.
Well, I'll bring it to a close with this line in that vein, which was one of my favorite lines of the book. It's from Rose, who I guess, I don't know how old Rose was when she first arrived in Mokama, but she was, I guess, the way you describe her, describing them, she said, they were all so big and imposing, and she would sometimes sit and look at them in awe, these strange, pale creatures. And I just love that. And we'll end on that note. Congratulations, Jyoti. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.